On time, very German. Great. So I already said my first sentences will be in German. So Nate, Emily, hold on. I'll be back to you in a second. Herzlich willkommen. Ihnen allen und vielen Dank, dass Sie Interesse zeigen, heute bei unserem BIX eigentlich Pizza-Seminar dabei zu sein. Sie wissen, normalerweise gibt es dann Pizza in der Mittagszeit und einen spannenden Vortrag. Den spannenden Vortrag gibt es heute auch, nur eben wieder mal keine Pizza und kein persönliches Zusammentreffen. Stattdessen haben wir jemanden eingeladen, Emily de la Bruyère und Nathan Picarsic, die an Themen gearbeitet haben, die sehr ähnlich oder zumindest in dem gleichen Feld sind wie die Themen, in denen das BIX in der Vergangenheit gearbeitet hat. Sie wissen, es ist nicht viele Wochen her, dass wir unsere Studie zu den verborgenen Kosten von nicht vertrauenswürdigen Anbietern in 5G-Netzwerken veröffentlicht haben und letztlich in der gleichen Runde, in dem gleichen Themenfeld arbeiten auch Emily und Nate. Und weil beide aus Amerika kommen, I do now switch to English. You all know that we are taping this presentation, and of course later on all of you will have the possibility to ask questions, either directly if you want to, then you have to virtually raise your hand with the respective button. Since I do not see everyone, please use that, or pose your question in the chat, and then I'll read it to you, and if you don't want to be named, then I'll pretend that it was my question. China and network great power ambitions is the topic of today's seminar, for which we invited Emily de la Bruyère and Nathan Picarsic. Both of them are from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and they also founded their own consulting firm, Horizon Advisory. So those of you who represent companies with interest in China, you might want to get in touch with either one of them or both of them. But today we want to know from you as the big experts on China about the communication and the strategy behind the communication of the Chinese government when it comes to, in particular, of course, 5G, but let's say in general, the communication network, cyber sphere of the Chinese government. I think the thesis here is that there's a difference between what they communicate towards us, let's say the West, and what it is that they are communicating internally. Before we opened this up, I told you BIX is doing a lot of security research with the background or the disciplinary background of economics. Normally, the economists would say, hey, open up all the markets and everything is fine. We have lots of competition, and that's the best for the people. Apparently, in the case in what we are looking at, this is a little different. And Emily and Nate, you will tell us why. And my understanding is, Emily, you will start. So thank you very much for coming to Berlin digitally today and doing this with us. And with this, Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting us digitally in Berlin and for that introduction. You framed the thesis perfectly. China's external messaging about telecommunications and about information technology more broadly focuses on this idea of win-win cooperation and the need for free markets and not to politicize these questions. But when we look at internal strategic discourse in China, what we see is a very clear competitive strategy and competitive orientation towards the question of information technology, including telecommunications, as well as a very deliberate industrial policy backing that up. At the broadest level, China's telecommunications ambitions exist as part of the larger network great power strategy, which is also translated as cyber great power strategy. This was first publicly presented by Xi Jinping in 2016, and it's effectively the blueprint according to which China intends to shape and also to govern the networks, the standards, and the platforms of the fourth industrial revolution. The network great power strategy is a global and it's a competitive project. It rests on 6 primary pillars. The 2 that we're going to talk about primarily today are first, core technologies and control over core technologies, and second, an effort to shape the international information technology architecture to influence the network or the cyberspace, which includes setting technical standards. The 4 additional pillars of the network great power strategy are first, construction of physical and virtual information infrastructure, both at home and abroad. Second, network security. Third, network governance, which primarily means party governance over the network, but also a broader party-led layout that includes the deployment of companies to support China's IT ambitions internationally. And finally, recruitment of talents, especially from abroad. Neither the network great power strategy nor these pillars tend to be discussed in external facing messaging, but at this point, they're widespread throughout Chinese discussion on IT and telecommunications. They integrate the physical and the virtual, including technology, infrastructure, and narrative. And they reflect, importantly, a very calculated balance that dates back decades and is a clear strain in Chinese industrial and scientific and technological and also competitive strategy, a balance between protection and openness, between Beijing's emphasis on relative autonomy at home, as well as its effort to acquire foreign technological resources and to influence foreign technological systems. So first, that core technology pillar. Core technology here refers to more foundational upstream technological and industrial inputs. So everything that IT systems are based on. Chips are a primary example, so are sensors. As Xi Jinping put it in 2016, this is a quote, "The control of core technology by others is our biggest hidden danger. No matter how large an internet company is, no matter how high its market value is, if it is heavily dependent on foreign countries for its core components, and if the major artery of the supply chain is in the hands of others, it is like building a house on someone else's foundation." And this really gets at the Chinese approach to that free market principle. We should open the borders, everyone should trade, everything will be great. Because if you do that, you might develop these dependencies on foundational inputs, and that would be like building a house on someone else's foundation. So China works to avoid this and to develop control over core technological industry chains through very deliberate industrial policy. And we say industrial policy, not scientific and technological policy, because the focus is very much not only and not even primarily on the advanced downstream S&T or its applications, so much as it is on the inputs into them. And Beijing invests in those inputs in order to foster asymmetric independence. China works to build up integrated core technology supply chains at home, while at the same time working to integrate Chinese companies, including backed by subsidies and preferential policies, into the international value and supply chains for core technological inputs. And Beijing frames these companies, with Huawei being, of course, the obvious example, as market players, like any others in external messaging. Though when you look at the internal discourse, you see that these are clearly tools of industrial strategy. In parallel with this very tangible industrial policy, Beijing also seeks this other network great power pillar, which is the effort to set international technical standards, to proliferate its IT influence and systems and architectures globally. Another Xi Jinping quote from 2016, we must accelerate the promotion of China's rulemaking power in cyberspace. Chinese strategic discourse paints rules or standards as the, quote, commanding heights. As Beijing sees it, the US and Europe were able to set global rules and standards in the last industrial revolution. In doing this, they locked in a kind of structural architectural power and influence that has been the reason they've been able to lead the global order ever since. And that really has cemented that upper hand. Now, in a new industrial revolution, there's a chance to leapfrog. New set of rules are being set, new networks are coming into shape. China wants to be the one to shape this architecture. So should this overall vision succeed, China would therefore have, first, asymmetric leverage over global IT systems, be able, say, to hold semiconductor supply at risk globally without facing reciprocal consequences, or to protect its own networks while infiltrating others. More strategically, China would also be able to govern the emerging international IT architecture, and therefore to grant its own commercial champions an advantage to shape how and where and what systems develop, and a result to claim both access to information and the ability to influence it and the networks over which it travels. So much of the discussion over Huawei and its risks thus far has seemed to center around tactical concerns on spying or espionage. But in this larger discussion of like the architectural power that comes from the new industrial revolution, we see a Chinese emphasis much more on a bigger thing than spying, on the idea of information-enabled global control. And we also see that question combining neatly with China's military-civil fusion strategy. In discussions of these commercial IT infrastructures, 5G included, as well as others, as supporters of military power projection, and also power projection more broadly, whether this is in terms outright of supporting military operations or less kinetically of disseminating propaganda to set a global narrative according to China's vision. And on that note, I will hand it over to Nate.
All right.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Tim, for the kind introduction and framing of ongoing debates. The range of insights from contemporary Chinese discourse that Emily raised offer us several policy relevant questions that we hope that continued analysis, like some of the work that we do, can contribute to in a multilateral fashion. As Tim very astutely summarized, the key point here is that China's approach to economic competition, and specifically to deriving strategic value from its commercial state champions, is different from the approach pursued by other market-based actors and firms across the information communication technology landscape. And the nuance of that difference between the Chinese industrial policy approach and that of market-based actors demands new thinking from governments as well as the private sector actors that are in the trenches of competing with China in technology competition. From the Chinese perspective, treating the domestic market as something that is distinct from the foreign market is not a novel framing. The fundamental economic development concept of two markets, two resources in Chinese is premised on just that, realizing that the foreign marketplace is an opportunity to be seized while the domestic is an endowment to be protected. This asymmetric orientation toward the domestic and the foreign markets has shaped Chinese economic and technology strategy since the early 1980s. And it comes through very clearly in the messages that Beijing conveys about its information communications technology ambitions, its broader digital ambitions, and the network great power strategy that Emily defined. Take, for example, industrial policy, as we've hinted at several times. At home in China, industrial policy is encouraged as the solution to core technology vulnerabilities, the building a home on someone else's foundation problem that Emily cited Xi Jinping about. Meanwhile, abroad in international competition, Chinese messaging from both governmental and firm level sources frames Chinese companies as normal private sector profit seekers, not the beneficiary of the CCP's largesse and direction, and meant to be treated like any other free market participant, despite the non-market support that they enjoy. In domestic discourse in China, it's clear that military and civilian networks are to be understood as one. This is the concept of military civil fusion, but much more tactically, it's reference to the reality that there's military utility to be derived from all information communications technologies. In foreign messaging, this risk is very clearly downplayed. Any security conception that may trigger in favor of emphasizing benefits at the same time, the security message is completely washed out by one that prioritizes the virtue of Chinese technological development, or just as often, the low-cost solutions that Chinese vendors can offer. And Tim and the team have done fantastic work on understanding the indirect and hidden costs that may be obscured by messaging that focuses on the low cost, immediate, direct orientation that the Chinese companies offer. And finally, on discourse about technical standards, a key domain and pillar of the network great power strategy that Emily outlined, it comes through clearly in Chinese discourse as an orienting objective across domains, not just in telecoms, though obviously it's a key factor when we talk about the 5G debate. While China's overseas messaging for Huawei and others in the sector aim to strike chords of cooperation, collaboration, and win-win mutual benefit. So we see a distinct set of voices and asymmetric means that support their operationalization. They support them globally, and they underscore from a Western democratic sense the need for a competitive response. We think of three fundamental lines of effort that could flow in responding to this Chinese affront and asymmetric orientation. We think it likely fruitful to begin with narrative, because that's where we see this messaging coming through in asymmetric and competitive ways. And there's a need to parse Chinese discourse and policy and action in primary sources from the Chinese perspective, and to share those to help to provide a baseline and fact-based ground truth against which messaging for Western ears can be validated. We also think there's a strong need for multilateral coordination of defensive mechanisms. So those would be actions like restricting access of Chinese vendors, cutting off access to technological exports. So the same sort of orienting goal as what would have propelled the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls during the Cold War, and the same for investment review, where there's a need to monitor foreign direct investment for risks of national security and intellectual property theft, and to do so in a way that's coordinated, so that we're not setting up each of our respective economies and firms in a race to the bottom, or a dilemma where incentives are increased for actors to engage with risky either national security or intellectual property theft actors. And then we also think there's a need for these efforts, the narrative and the defensive sort of cutting off of national security threats, to be paired with a positive alternative, what we'd think of as an offensive front in this competition, where we don't just say that one thing is bad and poses a national security threat, and that's the end of it. Instead, we say this thing poses a national security threat, and here is an alternative that offers a path forward and a solution to the technological and cost problems that heretofore Chinese vendors have largely been stepping in to solve. And we think, again, this is something that can and should be pursued in a multilateral fashion, where democratic allies can bring to the table different pieces of supply chains, different pieces of technological capacity, different pieces of market access to guarantee a trusted and secure solution. And across all three of these efforts, it seems necessary to increase monitoring of Chinese military actors with ties to the People's Liberation Army, as well as those with ties to the public security apparatus, the surveillance state, and a range of human rights abuses. And with that type of information, we think it's possible to shape and amplify investments across multilateral bodies to build back better in the current parlance in American politics, and to take advantage of existing bilateral as well as multilateral fora where there are pathways for action on these various lines of effort. So we think of key bilateral relationships like the US-German tie, as well as the role of actors like NATO for pursuing these types of lines of effort and increasing awareness of the potential national security and human rights risks that we embrace if we jump into the low-cost offerings that exist today. And with that, I would just again like to thank you all for the opportunity to contribute to this dialogue and also share our regrets that we are not joining you in person and instead are connecting through our computer screens here. Thank you.
Once again, just sitting in your own office and travel the world from your desk. Thank you both, Emily and Nate. That was an interesting opening for the debate to follow. I have the privilege that I see who else is on here, and I think we should have an interesting debate. But I take the privilege to ask the first one or two questions here, and maybe I want to force you to put things a little more into perspective, given you now speak to a European audience, and for a European, the word industrial policy doesn't sound as bad as it does for someone from the United States. If you go to Brussels, you hear it all the time. The EU, of course, wants to do industrial policy. So why isn't it fair that others are trying to do the same thing? Or is it just not more than industrial policy, seeking your own economic advantage in the global competition, but really also a tool of power politics or power projection beyond seeking the economic advantage? So I don't know who the two of you, how do you communicate who's answering that, but you can try.
Maybe I'll start and then Nate will disagree and then this will get fun. The point, I think, to our minds is not that China deploys industrial policy. It's the goal of that industrial policy. And it's very much intended to develop positions of asymmetric leverage within strategic global industry chains. So, for example, to control a given choke point such that that entire industry chain comes to depend upon Beijing, which can be used for everything from geopolitical leverage, like vis-a-vis Japan in 2010, or to obtain the technology of the downstream so that China can then leapfrog in those areas through, for example, forced technology transfer, where there's leverage because China controls the upstream. And I think, in this case, possibly recency bias, but the solar supply chain's a great example of this, where China has very deliberately developed dominance in polysilicon and other upstream inputs, and used that in turn to climb, polysilicon, and used that to climb up the industry chain and to reach a point where the really entire solar supply chain depends on Beijing, and China is willing to use that for its own ends.
Nate, you want to add something to that, or?
Yeah, I would just add that the additional asymmetry is the centralized nature of Chinese industrial policy. So even if we wanted to implement The European equivalents, I think, are less centralized, and certainly from the US perspective, even if we wanted to implement an aggressive industrial policy, it would come off as something that is much more fragmented and decentralized than the Chinese version, just by virtue of their political economic system. And what that means in terms of risk that make this different is that the concept of military civil fusion is something that can reliably generate returns and outcomes for the national security system in a way that other systems, again, may even have intent to realize, but also lack the centralization and state-backed mechanisms to guarantee. So there's a security risk that is real and only likely to increase from the Chinese pursuit of industrial policy, and that provides a foundation where you can have outcomes like the 2010 restriction of rare earth exports to the Japanese market, as Emily cited, which is, a fairly compelling peacetime incident. We don't have many examples of a peacetime coercive lever of that nature, which suggests that the Chinese system does indeed operate in a way that's slightly different from the rest of the world.
Right. So to the participants, if you have a question, raise your hand. Again, not visually, but here in the tool. Yeah, you have, and picking up on what you said last, Nate, you also mentioned that it is necessary to monitor the link between Chinese economic actors or business actors with the Chinese military. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? How, I mean, of course, there are say state institutions who do that, our intelligence services, but especially if you are a telecommunication company or maybe a foreign direct investor in China, what kind of help do you get, and how do you do this to monitor this close connection between the business world and the military world in China?
The overlaps can manifest in a number of ways, on the path from personnel through funding and operations. So the indicators that you could look for to identify proximity that may not necessarily be causal or reflective of intent, but I think they are reflective of the risk that any given cooperation or transaction could produce outcomes for the Chinese military or surveillance state, would be participation in military civil fusion activities like capability development bases, operating from industry zones or parks that are specifically identified by the Chinese system as military oriented or military civil fusion oriented, which then likely mean and correspond with another set of indicators that could monitor, which would be receipt of subsidies, government grants, and other backing that have very explicit military guidance and direction as a part of them. And again, this is at the surface, this is not something that's drastically different from the way defense industrial bases work elsewhere in the world, but there's a degree of centralization and leverage within this Chinese system that is fairly unique, and the effort invested for obscuring or framing in a very different light these types of interactions suggests that there's probably something real to the asymmetry of how China pursues this type of activity, and there are examples of where this can produce a type of force technology transfer interaction or a type of coercive leverage at a firm-to-firm level that does produce deleterious effect for Western interlocutors and produces positive returns for the Chinese side. So it sort of belies the win-win framing, if you will, and this positive for the Chinese side is something that then feeds into the either military or surveillance state apparatus, and most all of the Chinese actors who support a range of human rights abuses within the state domestically have benefited from Western technology. Is probably like the easiest surface level to point to.
Maybe one question for Emily. Why did this topic come so much to our attention with the appearance of 5G? Why wasn't it, the same issue when we introduced 4G, or as the Germans would say, LTE? Yeah, we name it a little different. But and maybe if you can try to look in the future, what will it mean for, if there's a 4G and a 5G, there most likely will also be a 6G one day. How do you see the path forward when it comes to the innovation in telecommunication networks?
So China's IT strategy is not new for the 5G era. It goes back some time, and even if the network great power strategy emerges in 2016, the core ideas underpinning it are very clear for really decades. And the idea of working to set standards and shape networks goes back at this point to about the early 2000s. There is, though, and I would say first of all that I think we've been short-sighted in only looking at 5G and not looking at other emerging foundational networks. But there is something about 5G that has the potential to make it more determinative, and therefore to make whatever gains or architectural power China is able to claim in this telecoms contest different and perhaps more significant. In theory, two core distinctions that come to mind. 5G is poised to be a kind of backbone network, a network that, because it's going to be, again, in theory, the catalyst for a new information of things era, that it then will become the host to all these new, really transformative networks and platforms that are built on top of it. Also networks and platforms that control not only the virtual world, but also the interplay between the virtual and the physical worlds. And because of that backbone status, the potential to shape the 5G system could lead to greater influence over the emerging IT architecture, as well as a more cemented position, because the more something is a backbone, the more difficult it becomes, as I'm sure your work makes very clear, to rip things out and to potentially replace them with alternatives. And then the other part of 5G on that cementing power element that's distinct is to the extent that 5G seems like it's going to force a new era of infrastructure for telecommunications in terms of new base stations that are built more closely together, et cetera. It once more has the potential to be a leapfrog moment because the built environment has outsized ramifications. And I mean, I think the shortest way to put this as we see it in Chinese discourse is that where some steps in the telecommunications generation advancement have been more about incremental gains, this one has the potential to be more of a leapfrog moment or a revolutionary moment. And so China can not only establish more influence through this one, but also lock that into a greater extent.
Yeah, understood. And if we go one step further, we spoke about industrial policy before. Ericsson and Nokia, two European companies, one from Sweden, one from Finland. As it looks right now where that in the 5G world, Chinese companies, in particular Huawei, has a bit of a let's say market success. What can this? How can they? What could it mean for the next generation of telecommunication networks if that translates in just grabbing the biggest part of the market and making life for the two European companies more difficult, or maybe even making it impossible for something like the Open RAN initiative to be successful. So, the question again, what's in the future, especially when we look at 6G and telecommunication networks in the future. Nate, maybe you want to, I don't know, anybody?
Yeah, I mean, I think the risk is that Chinese ecosystem control begets more than the base and foundational aspect of the backbone that Emily's talking about, and that this prejudices market opportunities downstream for Chinese players as well, so that your smart cities and your autonomous driving and your e-commerce use cases that build on top of the bandwidth and processing promises of 5G or 6G, regardless, I think bake in an advantage for the Chinese players who are certain to rise at the sort of app layer, and that with that kind of app layer dominance delivers also an asymmetric data advantage that then in turn locks in that gain and also generates or spins off a whole additional set of security risks, as we see already as the Chinese system optimizes for and around values and norms domestically that I think are in contradiction with traditional Western values and norms. Speaking of the human rights abuses that Chinese data dominance domestically, I think, help to perpetuate. So I think that's the future risk may less be seizing the backbone advantage, but maybe in seizing the downstream and kind of app layer that builds atop that backbone. And I think we're likely getting into a place where it's a very real concern that the market dominance of Chinese players and ownership of ecosystems will erode in an asymmetric way the cost of capital for the potential Western competitors, the Nokias, the Ericssons, and also those that could be rising with alternative technological solutions like the Open RAN approach, or others that we can't even anticipate, or maybe too early stage at this moment. So I think it's, but that is, I think, largely it's tied to reality and the operational progress and market dominance, but it's also a function of narrative and optics. And I think what it boils down to is cost of capital and market capitalization. If China is able to own the narrative and shape the perception of its inevitable rise and dominance in these fields, that's going to produce returns in terms of cost of capital for these firms and ability to invest, maybe not in R&D to win the next stage, but invest in subsidizing its downstream players that then produce this iterative or positive feedback loop between the backbone architecture and the app layer. And then the entire time, I think we're at risk of security vulnerabilities that some of which we're familiar with, and some of which will, be propelled by the technological capacity that we're seeing come online.
Okay. Now you have mentioned the one company that is always being mentioned when we talk about 5G in China, and that's Huawei. But since the two of you look at the country and at the sources much more closely, since you know the language, are there any other companies that we should be aware of beyond the obvious big elephant in the room, Huawei, that we should monitor?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, my answer is going to be very biased towards my focus more on upstream industry, but 5G isn't just about the Huawei's of the world. It's also, for example, about the IoT module. I think I'm saying the right word, the right phrase. Makers. So, for example, you have upstream players, and the company that comes to mind is called Quectel, that really dominate this industry chain and have like near global monopolies. And what that means is that even the other international operators are building their systems on these, again, core technology inputs, which gives China really cemented leverage, potential also for nefarious activity, and then gives an upper hand in the effort to build more vertically integrated supply chains to Chinese players. So like I'd look at the module makers, the chip, and even the infrastructure constructors to include in the ecosystem. And then obviously on top of Huawei, there are also the ZTEs or the China Mobiles. And if we only necessarily react to one of the big names, Beijing's also like very adept at then just repackaging that player under the umbrella of either a new or an old but not yet targeted entity.
Mm-hmm. Nate, any other names that we should have on our radar?
I think, across the value chain, a complete agreement with Emily's framing, and I would go all the way to the furthest upstream and think about the role that Chinese extractive industry has in the critical materials that are necessary for developing the next generation semiconductors and the next generation hardwares that we'll need. So the big six of the Chinese rare earth industry would be a set of actors that you maybe would benefit from being familiar with. And then on down, I think you can look at Huawei's chip supply chain, and you see actors like HiSilicon, but then there's also some redundancy in the Chinese industrial layout to include actors that fall under the guise of Sinhua Unigroup and a broad array of upstarts that are in the semiconductor space. And then the one downstream application space that I think likely merits attention and will draw more moving forward, given the way that the Chinese industrial and technological pathways seem to be coming together, would be in the autonomous driving space. So within the mobility sector, I think is framed in a way in the Chinese context a bit more broadly and inclusive, and it may be the AV companies and really next generation mobility writ large, so battery, EV, AV type companies that are positioned to be champions for the broader smart infrastructure push moving forward, and maybe the type that engage pretty actively on the global stage, so that have research and development partnerships with a diverse supply chain globally, and in particular in the German context. So I would look at the mobility sector, so the next generation sort of car companies in China, maybe ones that are worth following and certainly have benefited from a range of science and technology cooperation and experimentation efforts with Huawei, and then also are out there in the world cooperating with the legacy of mobility and auto production. Again, a space where Germany and its industrial prowess is the cutting edge.
Speaking of, I don't want you to give away basically the secret of your business model, but German companies, maybe a little different to American companies, see China not only as a source for, let's say, cheap products, but also as a market for machinery, for many of the industrial products that German companies seem to be good at. If you were to advise the typical middle-sized German, Schwabian producer of the world-leading machinery for something, who wants to either export to China, which they already almost all do, or even open up a production facility in China, what would be like the 3 major advices you give this middle-sized German company in respect to the things that you've mentioned earlier?
This is a very, very good and to the point question. So thank you. I think the first and foremost would be orienting for long-term strategic positioning vice short-term returns. So there are far too many examples from cutting edge down to very simple and plain applications where China's been willing to trade capital up front for long-term positioning. That's typically, in most cases, this is derived through a process of forced or even illicit technology transfer. So in the German context, perhaps think of Siemens and the high-speed rail business as one that 15 years ago was robust and backed by the leading edge technologically, and perhaps it was thought of as something of a moat that would prevent the typical Chinese industrial playbook from competing globally. But I think over the past 15 years we've seen that play out in a different way, and I would caution, I guess, any operator that those types of outcomes may in part be a function of placing near-term returns at the expense of strategic positioning long-term. So I would start from that sort of basic point, and then I think there's clear technological protection concerns. So any piece of technology or even a mold for a piece of equipment should be thought of, you should be promoting it just as much as you're protecting it. So you need to be investing in the protection and the monitoring and all of the corporate and legal sort of hardwiring that helps to protect against those interactions. And I think at a strategic level, from a business perspective, this protect versus promote balance should be pursued in terms of whatever it is that you're going to the Chinese market for, in terms of capital, in terms of customers, in terms of vendors. You should balance any exposure to the Chinese market with the alternative, because typically in most cases, this concept of 2 markets, 2 resources is real, and the protection of the domestic market is something that is intrinsic to the Chinese industrial policy and firm level decision making, such that in most cases you're not going to win the Chinese market if that's your goal. It's not going to happen. You may be a very special type of business that can establish some floor to what you can do in the Chinese market, but that floor in the Chinese market is going to come at the expense of your other business. So I would probably caution against any engagement and encouraged to balance that engagement with the alternative, so that you're not left at the whim of whatever it is, Chinese capital or Chinese customers, Chinese vendors.
Emily, any additions? No? All right. Then I have one last question, and I don't know, either you guys, not Emily and Nate, but everyone else does have difficulties finding the raising hand button. But yeah, most of the participants here are not from private businesses, but from German ministries. And if you need to balance the German interests from a foreign policy and strategic perspective on the one side, but also because of the aforementioned many German companies for whom China is an important export or production market, what's the advice you would give to German government representatives, how they could, let's say, stop or at least make sure that the backlash coming from China, if we make it more difficult for companies such as Huawei to grab a large part of the German telecommunication market, how can we make sure that the backlash is not going to threaten all the export business and the foreign direct investment that has already taken place? Any ideas there? Well, you don't have to.
I can go. I'm sorry.
I
think that the way that I think about the difficulty here is the degree to which China has pursued vertical integration in critical sectors means that we are posed with these dilemmas where inaction, meaning defecting from engagement with China, is the highest return, but in the immediate, but incrementally that's going to produce lower returns and eventually seed the demise of whatever piece of the value chain we may possess. So I think that the approach that I would counsel would be mapping out these value chains and finding the plausible alternatives, either in terms of supply or in terms of customer sets, and engaging the full arsenal of instruments that you have to cultivate a comparable integrated value chain that is clean of these types of military, human rights, and ultimately economic risks. So I think that Germany in particular has an incredibly strong hand vis-a-vis its European allies, vis-a-vis the United States and North American allies. And at the end of the day, I think that those markets remain the more critical ones, higher share of German GDP derived from EU and from North America than from China. So I would look to those, I would look to that strength and use it to develop, a toolkit of mapping out these critical supply chains, value chains for products and goods, and having that as a piece of informational and actionable value that can be delivered to companies who, have fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders or their ownership to produce returns, and I think are hesitant to make any defection decisions without something of a de-risking playbook. And I don't think that really exists by and large as of yet, even just at an informational level. But I think the challenge is the leverage that China has, both as a as a producer and as a consumer. So it's what China brings, the like bundled offering that China brings, either as a direct investor or as an inducement to bring a German actor into the Chinese market, is something that has never been matched in history, quite frankly. That they both offer low cost production and the promise eventually of a massive market opportunity. That bundling is not something that has ever been combated by industrial policy. So I think there's a need to combat both sides of that, which is mapping out whatever the value chain that we're talking about is and finding what the alternatives are. And I think again, Germany has a very strong hand, and they shouldn't be shy about playing it vis-a-vis the EU and vis-a-vis North American allies. And that type of logical strategic approach and real pressure is, I think, what's needed to spark a cascading effect in terms of how we generate alternatives to the Chinese market.
All right. So there was a lot of free advice, both for the business community here and also for the representatives of the German government or the executive branch. Emily, Nate, thank you very much for that. The topic here, China and network-grade power ambitions, will remain of great interest for, I guess, all of us, at least all European countries who seem to be a tiny little bit behind when it comes to rolling out 5G networks. And Germany just a little over a week ago decided how as part of a new legislation, the IT Security Law 2.0, how institutionally the market access of untrusted vendors in the newly established 5G networks can be limited. And we see other developments in other parts of Europe, like in Italy, where Tim, and that's not me, that's the telecommunication company in Italy, banned or completely threw out Huawei from their 5G network last week. So lots of developments in this field. Thank you very much for giving us your perspective. Yeah, let's hope we can continue this conversation, hopefully in person in the not too distant future. But for now, Emily, Nate, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. And everyone else, you will receive our invitation for the next PizzaSeminar, which is not yet scheduled. But you will receive it, don't worry. Thank you very much, all of you. Emily, Nathan, you have a great day. Everyone else, I hope yours ends soon, at least in the office. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.